Welcome along to this training presentation from Dicker Data. My name is Robert Crane, and again, if you need to contact me, my details are currently on the screen. Feel free to do that with any questions, queries, or feedback that you may have. As always, don't forget you can contact the good people at Dicker Data via microsoft.sales@dickerdata.com.au. They're ready, willing, and able to answer all your questions about what we talk about in this webinar, the products, the services, how to maximize your cloud business. So don't hesitate at any point in time to contact the good people at Dicker Data on microsoft.sales@dickerdata.com.au. Our weekly webinars have been running for a while now. We are coming to the end of season 1. We'll be taking a bit of a break and getting ready to jump into season 2. So we're always looking for ideas, suggestions, information. What do you want to see? What topics do you want to see covered? Has it been good? What would you like to see added to the series? So don't hesitate to do that. So again, season 1 of these webinars will finish in October. We'll take a bit of a break and watch out for details when season 2 will commence. But with that, let's dive into what we're going to cover in this presentation. So what we're going to cover is we're going to look at creating a virtual network. Then we're going to add a domain controller into that virtual network. We're going to configure our DNS so that everybody in that network can talk to that domain controller. And then we're going to add member servers to that network to give us more functionality. We'll finish off with our usual best practices and takeaways. Now, before we get too far into it, maybe a bit of a refresher on exactly what Azure is. So many people ask what Azure is, and I think the best answer to that question is that it is your on-demand data center. Now, what that means is that if you need a server to do a simple role, you can spin that up in Azure. If you need a website, you can again spin that up in Azure. If you needed multiple servers, or maybe you needed some automation processes, or if you needed to create a programming environment or develop a mobile app, all of these services are available in Azure, and they're basically charged on demand. So you only pay for the services that you use and the time that you use them, which is really good, which means that if you wanted to spin up a server, maybe to do an RDS environment, it would mean you'd have to go out and order the server, purchase the server, assemble it, run up the operating system, do all this sort of stuff. Now within Azure, we can basically power up a machine with the same sort of capacity, get it configured, get it running, test it out, and then when we're not using it, we can shut it down. Now when we shut it down, we're basically paying next to nothing for that. We're simply paying for a bit of storage. So again, in this world where customers need the agility to be able to take resources and use resources as they see fit, Azure gives you, especially as a reseller, that ability to go in with those resources and provide them on an on-demand, which means it gives you much more flexibility, and you yourself don't have to invest in a whole lot of infrastructure in your own data center, so you can bring that to a customer quickly and easily. Now, what's very staggering is to look at the momentum Azure is obtaining. Now, the most important figure generally is the one in the top left corner up there, which is showing 90,000 Azure subscriptions, new Azure subscriptions per month. Microsoft's also reporting that Azure is basically doubling revenue quarter on quarter, so it's growing extremely fast. And this is why it's such an important component for resellers to make sure that they're across. I mean, maybe you don't need to dive into all the developer aspects, but you certainly need to have some basic understanding of what Azure is, what it can do, and what services it can offer. Again, because there is so much demand for it, and it's growing and growing and growing and becoming such an important part of the Microsoft stack. Now, when we look at trying to understand where Azure fits in here, we start on the left-hand side. So on the left-hand side, we have our traditional package software, which we need to obviously go out and buy the equipment, network it together, put in the disks, and then build up servers so they can connect together, run the operating system, install the software, and then so on and so on, and run the data. Now, in that model, in package software there on the left, we're responsible for everything in that stack. We need to back up, maintain, make sure that it's all working. Now, when we move into Azure, for example, on the right-hand side, the first stack there is infrastructure as a service. So this is basically your virtual machine, stuff that is very similar to what's on premises now. So you have your virtualization layer, but that is basically handled by Microsoft. So Microsoft's responsibility is to provide a virtual machine platform. They maintain that, they patch the host, they make sure they're all networking together, they give you the console to make sure all that works. That's their responsibility. All you're responsible for is the operating system through to the applications. So you can choose whether to install Windows or Linux. Linux is supported on Azure machines, and then you put on your maybe your SQL programs and then your data, and off you go. But importantly, in infrastructure as a service is you're still responsible for the operating system, the middleware, and the data. So you have to have a contingency in place to manage that and make sure that that can be recovered. Now, the next step to the right takes us to platform as a service. So in this case, Microsoft is now managing everything basically from the middleware, the runtime, the actual application, all the way through to the networking. All you need to worry about is the data and your applications on top of that. So the best example of this is probably Azure SQL. So rather than spinning up your own Windows server, then installing and licensing SQL on it, maintaining it, patching it and updating it, trying to load balance and optimize it, we move to platform as a service, and that allows Microsoft to manage all of that. So they provide the SQL servers that are running on top of Windows servers that are load balanced, that are optimized, that are maintained, monitored, all that sort of stuff. All you're responsible for is the data and the application. So that's the trend that we're moving from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service. Now, the last option on the right there is software as a service. Now, the example here is something like Office 365, where Microsoft is responsible for the full stack. They basically have the data stored on their servers, and they are taking active backups to make sure all of that data is backed up and recoverable. So important thing is there's a big shift when it comes from moving from cloud computing all the way through to Azure, infrastructure as a service, then platform as a service, and software as a service. Now, what we're going to be focusing on here in this presentation is the infrastructure as a service side. So this is going to take the skills that you're most familiar with on premises, IP addressing, DNS, all that sort of stuff, and basically show you how to build a network in Azure. Now, it's important to appreciate just the breadth of the services that is available in Azure. So Azure has a base of 24 regions, 19 or more are online. This is more currently than AWS and Google combined. Now, the first level is the stuff you'll probably be very familiar with. So things like virtual machines, storage, networking, DNS, VPNs, all those sort of things come under the banner of infrastructure services. So they're basically already in Azure. So like I said, all the skills that you have around infrastructure on premises can be directly translated into this environment. Hopefully you'll get a bit of a feel of that as we work through this presentation. But important to remember that also, apart from those infrastructure services, Azure contains this huge range of additional options here. So in here, some of the things you can see are websites or web apps, logic apps. You can see machine learning. You can see multi-factor authentication. You've got the Azure AD Active Directory. You've got automation in PowerShell. You've got all these additional features. So what this gives you is the flexibility to move in a direction that would suit you. So if you want to move to more of a developer bent and maybe do some mobile apps, you can do that in Azure. If you're looking to move into maybe data queries or data analysis using SQL, that service is available. If you're looking to do analysis, machine learning, Hadoop, all that sort of stuff, again, is available. So you need to look at Azure not as a single product, but as a huge range of services and likewise a huge range of opportunities. Now, obviously you don't have to be across all of it. You don't have to know all of it immediately. Again, the recommendation is to focus on the things that you are familiar with, the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that's easy to get into, such as the compute, the storage, and the networking, which we'll do today. But again, don't overlook all these additional features that potentially are available for you to get into, create additional IP and services around. Now, as a Microsoft partner, you would generally get at least $100 worth of Azure credits every month, which means that you can go into Azure, you can spin up virtual machines, virtual networks, play with machine learning, run websites, and get a feel for it. And those credits renew every month. So every month you get another $100 to go in and play with Azure. So there really shouldn't be any reason not to be going in and playing with Azure. And hopefully, again, this presentation will give you the confidence to go in and maybe set up a basic network that you can then start going and playing with. Now, the way that we manage Azure is typically via two methods. We have our traditional console on the left, which is the one we'll be using in this case, but we also have a new preview portal, which is far more GUI based. So it has basically sliders and tiles and all that sort of stuff. So you can certainly use both. They both talk to each other. They both work well. Whichever interface works best for you. You can certainly use either one as your preference. The other thing I'll call your attention to is the fact that you can also use PowerShell to manage all of this, basically. So you can run up a virtual machine using PowerShell. You can create a virtual network using PowerShell. All of these commands can be done in PowerShell. Now, the advantage with that is if you have a repetitive process or something you want to repeat on a consistent basis, scripting it is generally the best way to go because that makes it easy to repeat, and it also makes it easy to hand off to others. So if you haven't got into looking at PowerShell, certainly recommend you do, because it is very important for all Microsoft products throughout the range from on-premises into the cloud. But again, it really gives you some power when it comes to automation. So again, don't overlook getting into PowerShell. So let's cover off the steps that we're going to run through today when we want to set up a network in Azure. So what we're going to do, the very first step we're going to do is create a virtual network. Now, the virtual network will be the container into which we will put our domain controller, our member servers, all our resources. But we need to create that first before we put everything into that. We then add a base virtual machine, which will just be a standard Windows server, into that virtual network. Now, this first virtual machine is going to act as our domain controller, but when we first put it in there, it's just a normal Windows server. Now, the next thing we're going to do is, once we've got that virtual machine up and running, is we're going to attach an additional data disk to that virtual machine. Now, we'll see the reason for that. Very, very important. Best practice that you always attach a data disk to a virtual machine when you set it up in Azure. Now, once we've got our data disk, we're going to add the AD role. So we're going to promote the Windows server, the standard Windows server, to a domain controller, and we're going to make sure that we put the databases on this data disk. Once we've got the domain controller up and running, we're going to set the DNS, and we set this not in the domain controller, we set this in the virtual network. So what that means is that when other machines, member servers, are looking for the domain controller to connect to the domain, they will have the right DNS information that we push to them basically by the virtual network. And once we've got all that up and running, we can then go in and basically spin up a new member server in the virtual network. It will get all the right settings. We can connect it to our domain, and it will then function as it would on premises. Now, the visual representation of this is that the very first thing we create is a virtual network. So again, think of a virtual network as a container, as a boundary, as a bucket into which we'll put all our resources. Very important that's created first. Then we will create a standard Windows Server VM. Okay, just a stock standard Windows Server VM, and put that into the virtual network. Then, as I mentioned, we will add a data disk to that Windows Server, so we'll have an additional disk for data that is attached to that Windows Server. And then, once we have that, we will then upgrade that server to being a domain controller. That domain controller will then live in that virtual network. With that done, as I mentioned, we will then set the DNS. Now, the DNS will be set in the virtual network. We don't need to set in the domain controller. That means that member machines, when they're added, will be able to get the right configuration to connect to the domain controller to be added to the domain. Then, once we've got all that, we can then start adding our member servers or member workstations, if we want to, into that virtual network. So, with that said, I will assume that the people listening and watching this are familiar with IP addressing. So, how IP addressing works, masks, routing, DNS, all that sort of infrastructure service. So, if you're working typically on premises now with local area networks, you should have all those skills and knowledge to do that. I'll also assume that you are familiar with Windows Server, things like adding a role to a server. So again, we spin up Windows Server, it's a plain server, we then have to go in and add roles. I will assume that you know how to do all that. Like a Windows Server can add a range of roles. In this case, we're just going to add AD, but we could add, for example, IIS as a web server role. I'm going to also assume that you're pretty familiar with adding additional storage to Windows Server. We'll cover that in a bit of basics, but I'm not going to drill into things like formatting disks and assigning NTFS rights, that sort of thing. So I'm going to assume that you're comfortable with doing all of that. Now, with all that said, let's actually get in and do something. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to create a virtual network. So in the bottom left-hand corner of our Azure console, you'll find a big plus button that says New. If we select that and then select Network Services, you'll see that the options there are Virtual Network. Now, when we select Virtual Network, we get a number of further options on the right. If we select the first option, Quick Create, basically we get a summary, a limited amount of fields that we can complete and fill in that will build our network very quickly. Not best practice. If you need something quick and dirty, Quick Create may be an option. The third option there is an import configuration. Now, what's interesting here is that to appreciate is that once you create a network configuration, you can export that and re-import that somewhere else. So if you want to create a standard configuration, a number of different locations or a number of different networks, or create it, delete it, and recreate it, again, you can export that configuration and then re-import it. So that saves you having to go through all the setup of the IP addresses, the masking, all that sort of routing, all that sort of stuff. You can overcome by exporting a configuration so that you've got a copy of it and you can template that and reuse that. The next option there is to register a DNS server. We'll come to that. That's basically where we set up and we tell the virtual network where to go for DNS inside our network. And you'll also see the last option there allows us to add a local network. So what that is when we start connecting on-premises equipment via site-to-site VPNs, we need to let the virtual network know in the cloud what the IP address of the local network is so it can make sure that routing is handled appropriately. So again, if we want to start connecting networks between locations, we're going to need to assign a local network. But the option we're going to select here is the custom create. This is the longer option but goes through all the options that are available. So basically select new network services, virtual network, and then select custom create. Now, when we select Custom Create, the first option we're presented with is to give the virtual network a name, a label, and then select a location. Now, best practice is to ensure that the name represents something that makes sense to you. So maybe the company name, a location, the region it's in, something specific. So again, if you can come up with a consistent naming convention for your networks. Then the important thing here is to note the location. Okay, so what this means is we're going to home our virtual network in a region. In this case, I've selected Australia. What that means is that the virtual machines we create and put in this virtual network will also be homed in that region. We can't, for example, typically take a machine that may be hosted in the US or run up in the US and then plonk it into our virtual network. If you have the situation with a business that has multiple locations spread across the world, then you may need to set up obviously 2 or more virtual networks and connect them together. So that's an important point to reinforce, is the fact that with Azure I can create as many different virtual networks as I want in different regions. So again, you're not restricted to just one virtual network. You can make and create as many as you want and configure them in any way that you wish. Now, once we've accepted that, we move to the next option. The next option is to set the DNS server and the VPN connectivity. Now, in this case, to keep it simple, we're not going to set any options. We're going to come back to the DNS servers later, and because we're creating a totally cloud-based environment, we're not going to connect this to any external locations, so we don't need to do our VPN. but we can always set these down the track, and if you wanted to, for example, to connect to on-premises equipment or networks, you would then select the option to go into a site-to-site VP connectivity. But we can return to that at a later stage and configure that if we want. But in this case, we're going to leave that blank. Now, the last option we generally get here is to set our IP addresses. So I've just accepted the default, which is a 10 network /8. You can go in and you can configure that to be whatever /net mask that you want. You also get the ability, as you can see, to create additional subnets. So what I've gone and done is created a second subnet, which is 10.32. So what I've got is a virtual network. The primary network is 10.0, and I've created a subnet which is 10.32. So this might be used for DMZ. It might be used, for example, you put your servers in one, your databases in another, your web servers in a third network. Make sure they talk together, but then you can put restrictions on which networks can talk and how information can be moved between those networks. So important to remember that this is where the understanding of the TCP/IP comes into it. So make sure that you get the right networks and you create the amount of subnets that you do need. Now, that basically finishes the creation of our virtual network. We then basically need to create our virtual machines in that network. Now, if we just take a virtual machine and create it without doing a virtual network first, what happens is the virtual machines by default are created in something called a cloud service. Now, the cloud service typically has its own public IP, a public DNS name, it has an internet firewall, it's a load balancing boundary. But the cloud services are unique from each other. So you can't generally run up a server and then run up another one and then try and network them together, because they're basically in two independent buckets that can't talk to each other. That's why we need to create a virtual network first, and then make sure when we run up the virtual machines that we put those machines or connect those machines to our virtual network. Now, the way that we do that is when we're configuring our virtual machine on Azure, you'll see that I have the option to select the region and the affinity group or whatever. So that is generally where I say I want to put it in Australia or the US or whatever. But when I do that now, you'll see that I have at the top of the list here a number of virtual networks. At the moment, I have 2 virtual networks that I can select from. These are the ones that I've already pre-configured. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select to put this new virtual machine, which is the first one that we're going to configure in our network. I'm going to put that on the selected virtual network. Now, when we do that, if we also have subnets configured as part of that virtual network, will then be prompted, or we have the option to select which subnet it goes in. So in this case, I'm going to put the domain controller on the main subnet, which is 10.0, but as you can see, I also have the option to put it in 10.32 if I want. So if I have a DMZ or I want a separate routable network, then I can certainly set that up and add the virtual machine to that. So basically, running up a virtual machine is exactly the same. The main difference is you just need to go in, and instead of selecting the region as Australia or a data center, you basically go in and select your virtual network. Now, once we've got all that, our virtual machine will be up and running. We'll be sitting in our virtual network, but there's an important concept to understand here when it comes to the storage that is part of virtual machines. The important thing to remember is that by default, when a virtual machine is configured, it is configured with a C drive, which is operating system disk, and also a D drive. Now, the D drive, importantly, is only temporary. It means when the machine shut down or when it's rebooted, that drive is recreated and all the data, all the information on it is generally lost. So why do you want a temporary storage disk? You can use it for page files, temporary files, all that sort of stuff. But remember, on reboot, that temporary file is then erased. So that's not a good place to be putting your data. Likewise, putting the data on the operating disk is not a good idea, because if there are ever issues, patches, updates, or for some reason the virtual machine has an issue and it won't boot, or you lose connectivity, then you've also lost access to your information, which can be very, very painful. So the recommendation, the best practice is for all virtual machines in Azure is that you go in and create an additional data disk and attach that disk to the virtual machine. Once you've attached that data disk is then where you put all the information that you want kept. So, for example, it could be your files, could be your databases, could be whatever. So, best practice is spin up a virtual machine, leave the C drive as it is, leave the D drive as it is, add a data disk of whatever size is appropriate, and put all the information into that. Now, what that means is if there is ever a problem with that virtual machine, it's easy to detach that data disk and maybe attach it to a clean virtual machine so it can come up, so you can configure that and get up and running. So again, strongest recommendation on best practice is always add a data disk to an Azure virtual machine and leave typically the C and the D drives as is. Now, the way that you add a disk to a virtual machine is in your list of the virtual machines in your management console. You basically select the virtual machine you want to add the disk to, and then on the buttons down the bottom, you'll see that there is an option there to attach. So basically, all we need to do is select the virtual machine, then select the attach button. We'll then be prompted to enter the details of the empty disk that we want to create. Now, you can specify a location, a file name, but typically all you need to specify is the size in gigabytes. Okay, so again, in this case, I've added a 100 gig disk as a data disk. I'm attaching that. It'll take a few moments for that to spin up and attach. Now, once that has attached, it just appears like any additional disk in Windows. So in this case, once the disk is attached, if I go into the disk management within the Windows management area, you'll see that I need to initialize the disk. I then need to format it. I then need to assign it a drive letter. So once I've attached the disk in Azure to a virtual machine, the operating system takes over and just sees that as a normal blank disk that needs to be configured appropriately. Now, once that's all initialized, configured, and up and running, you'll see that I now have that additional data disk in my environment. So I have a C, which is my operating system. I have my D, which is temporary, obviously a DVD, a virtual DVD drive, but importantly, I have a data disk, my F disk, onto which I'm going to put the data that I want to keep. Now, once we've got our data disk added, the next thing we want to do is basically promote this server, which is the general Windows server, to becoming a domain controller. Now, the way that we do that is we go into the Windows Server Management console, we select the server, and then we select the option to add a role. Now, the role that we select here from the list is basically our Active Directory domain services. Now, you can add additional ones as you require, but in this case, all I'm going to do is simply go in and select the Active Directory domain services, follow the bouncing ball, let that complete, and then once that's complete, we then have to go in and configure the Active Directory. We have to set up a domain name and all that sort of stuff. Now, one of the options that when you set up this AD role is where do you want to put the Active Directory database and the sys file. This is the reason we added an additional data disk, because what we want to do is we want to put all of these data items, okay, so our database, log files, and sys file, we want to change that from being the default C drive on the operating system disk to our data disk, which is our F drive. Now, what that means, as I pointed out, is that if we ever need to access that disk or maybe attach it to a clean image and rebuild it or do something with it, we can much more easily do that with if it's just an additional data disk. So again, go in there when you're running up the AD roles. At this point, when you need to specify the location of the databases and the sys file, make sure that you specify those as the F drive. Don't leave them on the C drive. Now, that will then complete our process of running up our domain controller. It'll be in our network. It'll be good to go. Now, the issue is if we try and add a member server, the member server needs to use DNS to be able to connect to our Active Directory so it can join the domain. It's going to fail. So what we need to do is we need to go back into the Azure Management console. We need to go into our virtual network. And what we need to do is select the option here to configure. Now, when we select that, you'll see that under DNS servers, I have the option here to add the server name and the IP address. Now in this case, I know that my domain controller is taking the first IP address available, which is 10.0.4, and that's the name of it. So I add that into my DNS servers, save the configuration, and what that means is that when a new server is booted up in my virtual network environment, it will receive a dynamic IP address by default, but it will also receive the appropriate DNS information to allow it to communicate directly to the domain controller that we have installed. Now, when we run up a member, so we run up the servers now, we fire them up and we have a look at the IP addresses, we'll see that the internal IP address of our domain controller is our first available IP address. So that basically is .4. Now, if we power up another server, a member server in this case, maybe it's going to be an SQL server, okay, it's going to be .5. So it's going to take the next IP address. So again, these are dynamically allocated. You'll see that I still have a different public IP address, but again, these are receiving their IP addresses from, and their DNS information, basically from the virtual network that we have configured and placed them into. So once we've done our DNS, that means that member servers can find that. Basically, we just run up a virtual machine as we did, put it in the network as we did initially with the domain controller, connect it to the virtual network, finish powering it up, boot it up, connect to it, and then add it to the domain as we would any other way on premises. Excuse me. So what that means is that once we've done all of this, that once the member server is up and running, it sees the domain server, it doesn't know about virtual networks and all that stuff. So again, it's exactly the same as it is on premises. We simply go into the workgroup options, we change it from workgroup to domain. We put the domain of the domain controller we just created into that, and then we should basically then be welcomed into the domain. We should just connect to the domain, and it should allow us to connect and basically now be configured for that network, just as is on premise. Now we can keep doing that with member server to member server to member server. That's all thanks to the IP addresses being allocated and the DNS information being pushed from the virtual network to the machines as they power up. So really easy once we've done all that and configured it, and again, makes those resources easy to join to a domain. So with that, let's look at some best practices here from our time. So first important thing is to create the virtual network first. Make sure you create the bucket into which you're going to place the virtual machines, any additional resources, so that they can all be tied together. If you don't do that, they all end up in separate buckets which don't talk to each other. So first critical point is to create the virtual network first and configure that appropriately with the IP addresses, the subnets, the locations, all that sort of stuff that you need. Then always make sure as a best practice you add data disk to all VMs. You don't want any data, if you can avoid it, being on the C. You certainly don't want it on the D, which is temporary, but you certainly don't want it on operating system disk. You want it in a separate disk, which you should add in manually. So that means that gives you the flexibility to attach that disk, put on a new clean VM, and do a recovery much quicker if you need to. So again, best practice, always add data disks to a virtual machine. Don't go in and assign static IP addresses to your virtual machines. Let the virtual network handle that. Again, we'll come to an option here if you do need to do that. But importantly, again, don't go in and assign a static IP address to your virtual machines. It may seem intuitive, but you run the risk of losing connectivity to those machines in your virtual network, and that may also mean that you can't manage them and you can't access their console, so you can't RDP into them if need be. So again, do not assign, as best practice, IP addresses to virtual machines manually. Allow the virtual network to do that. Again, make sure that you set the DNS settings in the virtual network. Don't go in and do that inside on the on the domain controller. Do it outside of the virtual network so it can be pushed out to all machines. That is, again, the best practice configuration, and again, what makes it a little bit different from on premises. Remember that no matter where a single virtual machine is located, it is not fault tolerant. So if you have a single domain controller on premises and it fails, then there are no domain services. Okay, so same thing in Azure here. If you have a single domain controller in a virtual network and it fails, then you'll have no domain services. So Azure gives you the flexibility to quickly and easily create load balanced and what's called affinity sets to make sure they're both running. You can then optimize the machines so that maybe they don't need as much power. That can reduce the cost. There are a lot more options when it comes to Azure. But remember, no matter where a virtual machine is located, if it is only a single machine doing a single role and it fails, that role will be unavailable. So again, keep that in mind when you're designing your Azure network. Now, if you do want to assign a static internal IP address, the best way to do it is to use PowerShell. So you can use the PowerShell command set-azure static vnet IP minus IP address. Okay, so you can go in there, you can set it to be 10.0.4, so that means if it reboots, if it's been powered off for a while, it'll always come back with that network. It basically sets a reservation for that in the virtual network. So if you do want to assign a static IP address to your domain controller, again, don't go in manually and do it. Use PowerShell to assign that. And the other thing you may want to have a look at, you may want to remove or update some of the DNS forwarders. Okay, so that depends on how you want to configure your DNS and all that sort of stuff. So again, don't forget the DNS forwards are still in there. You may want to go into that within your domain controller and actually remove that, delete that, and allow the virtual network to take care of that. So our takeaways from today are get the underlying networking right first. So that means a virtual network. Make sure that the DNS is correct. Make sure the IPs are correct, routable. If you want to do site-to-site VPNs, understand how that's going to route, set that all up again, and then build things up steadily, right? So understand what's going on here and make sure the configuration is appropriate. Like any infrastructure, again, well designed, well understood, well documented, reduces the amount of errors and problems that do occur down the track. The configurations you've got here, again, are going to be slightly different from on-premises. So, for example, you don't want to set a manual static IP. You're basically going to set the DNS outside. You may have to use PowerShell to do a few things here. So there aren't huge differences, but things like adding a data disk are best practice that in the Azure environment, it makes things a lot easier because there may be situations where obviously you can't get to a failed virtual machine because you haven't got access to that virtualization layer that is controlled by Microsoft. So again, some of the best practices you need to adopt here are slightly different from on-premises, but generally done correctly, they'll give you a lot more flexibility and make working with Azure much, much easier. Now, as I pointed out and reinforce again, single servers anywhere are not fault tolerant. So no matter where they are, on-premises or in the cloud, if you only have one server running one role and that server is unavailable for some reason, those services won't be available. So in Azure, we can set up basically fault tolerant. We can load balance them. We can put them into affinity groups so that one's down, the other one's not. Again, make sure that you understand this.
The system has detected that a minimum number of lines are connected to this conference. Do you want to continue your meeting? Press 1 to confirm. If there is no response, the conference will end.
So again, the other thing to remember here, there's plenty of good documentation that is available. Just go into the Azure and there will be in the resources that we're about to run into. Okay, so again, some huge resources here. Go through them, have a look at them. I'll make sure that this is available after the fact. You can download these and again, query these. Plenty of great information, lots and lots of information about Azure, especially setting up domains and virtual networks. So again, let us know where your business is located. We'll probably do that offline since we're running short of time. Remember that you can contact Dicadata via microsoft.sales@dicadata.com.au. They're all the appropriate contact details that you can refer to people. And again, once again, thank you very much for attending. Just again, letting you know that our season of Academy presentations has come to a completion. We'll look at starting Season 2 very shortly after a break to refresh ourselves and work out what we will do going forward. If you have any suggestions, please contact us again at microsoft.sales@dickerdata.com.au. But in the meantime, you can contact me via director@ciaops.com. But with that, I'll thank you very much for attending and wish you all